Michael. Thank you for being here today with us. I'm going to introduce you a little bit for the people who's watching us. So you're an archaeologist
Yes.
and professor. Are you still the director of the Institute of Archaeology, right?
Yes.
At the Southern Adventist University in Tennessee?
Correct.
Okay. And well, you've participated and directed archaeological excavations in sites such Gezer, Lachish. You've also, you are an author of several books
Yes.
and speaker, of course. And this is what I've read about you, and I liked it, is that you're known for your balanced approach, integrating faith and, of course, rigorous scholarship. Is it right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Try to.
That's good. So, is there anything that you want to mention, like it's worth mentioning, or you would like to be known for?
Well, I got introduced to archaeology as a young person. I went to Israel for the first time with my father, and he was a professor as well and always loved the Middle East. And so he had a speaking appointment at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem one year, and he said, if you want to come with me, you can stay in the hotel room with me. I'll pay for your food, but you have to pay for the airfare.
Oh,
So I had to work all summer for the airfare. And the trip was at the beginning of the summer, and we had a great time, and it introduced me to the world that I'd grown up hearing about and reading about, but it provided a dimension to that world that I had never really experienced before. I was walking through the streets of Jerusalem. My dad was in his meetings, and he says, you go wherever you want to go, and I was 17 years old, and I thought, okay. And I walked through the streets of Jerusalem. We were in Jordan. We went to the Sinai Peninsula. We hiked up the traditional Mount Sinai. We saw a lot in those 10 days. And I came back. I was like, wow, this is just, yeah, we read these stories and we don't always connect the stories to the real places and the real people and, you know, the descendants of these people. So that was very special. And I came back. I'd always wanted to be a medical doctor, actually, but I came back thinking more and more about, I loved science. I love traveling. I love history. This kind of combined everything kind of together for me. And so with time, I started, well, actually that next year, I started volunteering at an archaeological museum.
wow.
I started studying archaeology. I went on my first excavation a couple of years later. And I just fell in love with the discipline and have been involved with it ever since. And I'm very lucky because I get to do something that I absolutely love doing and
That's
feel very
cool.
exciting, yeah.
So you are an Adventist from birth?
I am. My grandfather was a Seventh-day Adventist minister and pastor. My dad was a theologian and a pastor as well. And so yeah, I grew up in a very good Christian home, and but we all go through, you know, different experiences in
Yeah.
life and thinking about faith, and we have to make it our own eventually. And so archaeology helped me with that journey very much because I was able to really integrate faith and thinking and philosophy and all of those things that I think a person has to kind of become a whole person in many ways.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And you're married?
I'm married. My wife is Brazilian, and we have 2 daughters, and we all have grown up. My wife is a professor of art history, so she looks at the art side of things, sculpture and art and everything, and I dig up the art that she studies sometimes. She's also an illustrator and artist, so she has gone with me on excavations to illustrate technically the different artifacts that we find. So we've worked very well together, and that's been a blessing too.
Okay, so are your daughters interested in
They
archaeology?
are. They grew up with
Follow?
it. They grew up with it. They didn't follow completely, kind of. Sarah, our oldest, Daniela, she is a graphic designer, so she kind of followed in her mom's footsteps. And they all grew up in the field, so we all brought them with us on our excavations in the summers. So when we would be overseas for 10 weeks usually, and that's been part of their life. So when we go to Israel, that's like their second home. We've spent so much time there together.
So
That's
that's a
been really,
blessing
that's been really
too,
neat. Yeah, for them.
because you don't have to be a part of the family every time
Exactly.
you travel.
We made that a priority. We saw a lot of other people in our field that didn't do that, and it really was very stressful on the family.
Mm-hmm.
So because we're both professors and we have the summers off, we could do that. Other families can't necessarily do that.
Sure.
So, but we made that a priority. So when the girls turned 9 and 11, we said, okay, we're going to start taking them with us on the digs. Before that, they always traveled with us, but not necessarily on the digs, because the digs are really, really intense, and yeah, it's hard.
Did they enjoy it?
They did. Daniela was 11, our oldest, and Sarah was 9. And Sarah, maybe a little bit too young. My wife was back at camp, kind of managing the camp and doing illustrations and doing those kinds of things, and running all the data and the databases and that kind of thing, and keeping all of that together. So she was not as involved, but Daniela came immediately out into the field. She would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning with
Wow.
everybody else. She would be out in the field digging till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then we would have our siesta in the afternoon for 2 hours, and then we would get up and we would do pottery washing and pottery reading, and then we would have a lecture in the evening, and then we would, yeah, do last minute things before going to bed to get up the next morning at 4. So she was completely involved in that, and she became a very, very good excavator. Sarah is a very meticulous person also, and she became the kind of the excavation coordinator. So she had her desk, and every square supervisor had to come to her for any kind of locus number or any kind of. She kept track of all the objects. She kept track of everything. She had her
Very
database there. She was very organized. So she started doing that at a very young age and kind of moved into that. Didn't dig quite as much, although she loved digging too. But Daniela loved to be down in the.
So you're a great team. You're a family together, right?
Yeah, we try to make that work. Yeah, that was
That's
really
cool.
that was good.
That's cool.
It's good.
Well, talking about this, archaeology is often involves long hours
Yes.
of tough conditions. So how do you keep motivated in this diggings?
It's it's very challenging. It's kind of like I said, we get up super early. We work 5 days a week, and then on the weekend we're touring the students. So it's nonstop really. Our seasons are between 6 and 8 weeks usually.
Wow.
And there's always set up time a week before, beforehand, and a week later. So it's often much longer there that way as well. And it's challenging, but the thrill of discovery, the thrill of finding things, the thrill of working together as a team. We usually have people from 16 different countries working together. We work with the Hebrew University. We partner with them, and then we have volunteers coming from all over the world. And we had a consortium of institutions also that we worked with from South Africa, from Bolivia, from Spain as well, from different places. And we tried to integrate this and share the experience with as many different people as possible. So it made it very rich and very cosmopolitan and very, very exciting that way. So it was very good. And the toughness, yeah, you just learn to go with it. I tell the students, they always ask afterwards, because in the States we have to take some general education courses and they have to take physical education, PD classes. And so they're always like, why don't we get PE credit for this? Because we have to work so hard. We're with shovels and we're with picks, and really it's not all little instruments. That's only when you get down to the floor. It's before that, it's heavy moving of dirt and everything. So, but it's really good. I like the balance because, as a scholar, you're often in libraries, you're often in books, you're teaching, but then in the summer you're in a Bally's gym. You're in a gym. You're working, and it's healthy. You're out in the sun, and it's really good. So we've always enjoyed that balance of things.
That's great. So, what has been the most challenging archaeological site you've worked in, and how did you overcome that challenge?
That's a tough question because I worked at 12 different sites over the course of my career, almost 40 years now. And some of them were long-term projects, some of them short-term projects. I think the most complex kind of site that we've worked at is a tell site. That's an Arabic or a Hebrew word for ruin. And tells are found all over the Middle East, but they're multi-layered cities that are simply one on top of the other. So we have sometimes 15, 17 cities on
Wow.
top of each other. And from far away, it looks like a garbage dump. It kind of looks like a landfill. In the United States, we have cities with these big landfills out in the country where people bring their garbage, and that's what it looks like. It's got grass on the sides, but underneath that are the city walls, are the cities, are the ruins of those cities as they're rebuilt century after century or whatever, every 50 years or whatever it is. And so, yeah, that's challenging because dirt is dirt and it all kind of blends together, kind of looks the same after a while, but you have to distinguish between, what is mud brick, which is also made out of dirt, and what is just sediment. And so you have to know the differences in consistency and firmness and color. You have to look at a lot of different things. You look at things stratigraphically. You can see the layers in the section that is left unexcavated. You can kind of see that. If you miss a floor, you will see that you missed a floor because all the pottery is there. Sometimes there's some plaster or something on the floor. That's very obvious. But usually it's just a beaten earth surface. And so you can miss those quite easily. So it's complex because you always are working in only maybe 5-10 centimeter sections at a time or at a time. And then you have to assess where you're at and you have to figure out, okay, is this something new? Is there a pit that is here? If you have a stone wall, that's easy. But if it's mud, like I said, if it's mud brick or something, it can be very challenging. So yeah, discerning the various levels. And so when we worked at the site of Lachish, for example, where we worked through 6 of these cities, if you will, that can be very challenging to distinguish between them and to try to figure things out. But we were successful. We use the latest technology when we excavate. We use GPS. We use what we call cyber archaeology, where we're using drones, and we do drone photography. We draw all of our plans on Illustrator often, using photogrammetry and using different kinds of that. We were kind of pioneering that in Israel for some time in the early 2000s. And so that was kind of neat to see that continue on through various projects.
Is
But
there
yeah,
a way to scan before you dig to see
yes,
what's inside?
that's a good question. Yes, we do ground penetrating radar sometimes. There's magnetometry as well, which is reading the magnetic elements under the ground. It works sometimes it doesn't work as well, but we try to do that before we start excavating. We also do surface surveys where we're just collecting things off the surface because that can give us a good idea from the pottery on the surface what might be there.
So you don't ruin it
Yeah,
when you dig.
yeah. So you figure out where you can start digging and where you want to strategically begin because you can never excavate the whole site.
Yeah.
These sites are so huge, you could work for 700 years and never excavate the whole site. So you have to choose very strategically what your research design is, what you're trying to accomplish, and where you're working. And that can be very exciting. So yeah, it's grueling, it's tough. We usually take our vacation before the dig. One time we stopped in Spain here because we hadn't been to Spain before, so we stopped for 3 weeks and then we went on the dig. But we almost need a vacation after the dig too, because it can be very intense.
You need it.
Yeah. So I would say Lachish was one of the most challenging sites. Gezer, the first site, was a similar tell site. Hatzor, I've worked at several of these kinds of sites. And then other ones, it's very simple when you only have 1 or 2 cities, because then you can distinguish very easily. And so Kirbet Kayafa, where I worked, was fabulous because it was a site that basically had a city from the time of Alexander the Great, and then a 700-year gap, and then the city from the time of Saul and David,
Wow.
from the early, from the 10th century, from about 1000 BC. So that was really, wow, yeah.
Wow.
We had all the original architecture. We had hundreds of storage jars and different pottery almost intact. We just they were crushed, but you had to put them back together again. And it was just very, very fascinating that way. So it varies. Every site is different. You have different problems, different issues, different time periods that you're dealing with. But all of that to piece together what took place in the past and to try to get a better idea of the life ways of the people who lived there.
That's so cool. You need to take me sometime. Have you ever made a discovery that changed your perspective or contrasted your beliefs, your biblical beliefs?
All the time when you're excavating in the Middle East, you're constantly being confronted with the reality of these people. And I've worked at Philistine sites. The Philistines were the coastal people that were the major antagonists to Israel. I've worked at Judean sites, Israelite sites. I've worked at Canaanite sites. I've worked in Jordan. I've worked in Cyprus. I've worked in different countries. Every place you have different things. In my experience, all of it contributes to a deeper understanding of biblical history. Not all of it contributes directly to biblical history, but all of it in a general way does. And it's extremely rewarding. Just to give you an example, at Kirbet Kayafa, we didn't know what to expect. It was a new site. It had never been excavated before. We had seen some stones on the side of the site that indicated perhaps a gate, very large stones of about 9 tons each. And so we knew this was a monumental architecture and could be dating to an early time period, but until we went there, we really didn't know what it was going to be. My colleague started the project for 2 weeks. Then he invited me in 2007 to join him as the senior American partner. And we started working together for the next several years. And that site was the biggest contribution that we could have imagined to the whole debate about Saul, David, and Solomon, the early kings of Judah and Israel, really. And what made it so interesting was there had been a debate going for a number of years about whether David and Solomon even existed or not. Their names had never been found outside the archaeological record. It's outside of the Bible in the archaeological record, and so we really didn't have, some people just said, well, we haven't found them, so we don't think they might have existed. Kind of an argument from silence.
Yeah.
Archaeology, you can never make arguments from silence. That's not a good scientific way to work. You make arguments based on data. And so the data was really new data that was coming up from the site. And we found a city that dates back to the time of Saul and David. And it gave such an important insight into that early history that was really, really important. We found fortifications, all the things that the other skeptics had said really didn't exist during that time. We found a city, we found fortifications, we found the type of architecture, these double walls that surround the city. We found evidence of how people ate. They did not have there were no pig bones at the site at all. By the way, when we collect, we also collect bones because we want to know the diet of the people.
Wow,
And
that's
it's
so cool.
it's very interesting that at this site and many Judean sites, you will have sheep, you will have goat, you'll have
Beef.
cattle, beef, right? All those things. But many Judean sites do not have any pig bones because that goes back to the Levitical laws about eating kosher and all of that. So at this site, after excavating 25% of the site, which is a huge amount, and usually it's only 5%, we didn't find a single pig bone. A few kilometers away are the Philistine cities. 30% of the bones there are pig bones.
Wow.
So we know the Philistines were eating. So that gives you kind of an insight and gives you also an ethnic marker. Sometimes, well, these people were not, these people were, what was going on. And interestingly enough, the Philistine pigs, we've done analysis now on them, and they are European. We've done DNA analysis on them, and they're coming from Europe. And we know the Philistines came from the Aegean world, from Greece, from Europe. And so maybe they brought them with. Anyway, there's all kinds of implications on that. But so for me, there are questions that come up sometimes. We don't have all the answers all the time, but I have found more evidence in my experience that support the history of the Bible than the other way around. And if I have a question that I can't answer specifically at this point in time, I'll just wait and see. You realize the more you're in a field, how little you know and how little there is that you've actually excavated even after 200 years. And so you kind of, you wait and see. As far as David goes, this is a good example. A scholar in England published a book in 1992 saying David never existed because we haven't found his name. He's a biblical scholar. The next year, archaeologists found an inscription at the site of Tel Dan, and it mentions the house of Israel and the house of David, which is the reference to Judah. And that's how the Bible refers to Judah over and over again. So I really think, that's why I do what I do. It's to find new information, to add new data to the big questions that we have. And our site at Kirbet Kayafa really revolutionized our discussion on the early kings of Judah in many ways.
Well, I'm learning a lot.
Anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but
How can we trust archaeology as a tool to validate biblical accounts when many interpretations seem to rely on specific cultural and theological contexts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Archaeologists, of course, also have to interpret. So we have the data. We're all looking at the same data,
Mm-hmm.
whether we're agnostic, atheist, Christian, Jewish, whatever our experience is, our life experience is, and our beliefs are. So we're all assessing the same data. And we should never be afraid of that data, because the data is what well, we do that all the time in life, right?
It's what it is.
It is what it is, right? We assess and make our life decisions and our philosophies based on the data that we know and then the assessment that we make. So yeah, so we're all looking at the same data, but I think that for me as a Christian, sometimes I think that we can ask questions that maybe others are not asking because they have decided that those questions aren't valid anymore. So we all know what skeptics are saying about the Bible, but they're not asking certain questions anymore because many of them have already made up their mind about something. And I think as Christians and as, you know, believers, we can often ask new questions, perhaps, and even pursue ideas that maybe someone else wouldn't pursue because they've already decided of something. And we have to be careful too that we don't fall into that category as well. We have to keep our minds open. But I think for me, it's been very encouraging the last 40 years to see the enormous amount of material that we do know today compared to when I started in the field. I mean, it's night and day. We have so much more information, and so much is there that can help confirm the Bible. I don't like to use the word proof
Mhm.
because that's kind of a scientific term, and it kind of is if you find evidence to prove the Bible, or that's your goal, well, then the counterpart to proof is disproof.
Yeah.
And I think the Bible as a book of faith stands on its own in a sense. It has its own validations outside of these things, and yet, at the same time, the Bible is different from other world religions because it's based in history, and that gives it an aspect that you don't have in other religions. And I don't want to be disparaging of any religions or
Mhm.
anything, but I would just say that you would never find anywhere an institute of Hindu archaeology or of Buddhist archaeology, because those religions are not tied to the realia of life and the people
Hmm.
in the same way. They're more esoteric, they're more philosophical,
Yeah.
and they're not rooted the same way as the Bible is in the land and in the people and the places. And just to give you an example, when you read through the Bible, you start in Genesis, and already you have names of cities and you have names of rivers already in the first few chapters of Genesis, and that continues. By the time you get to chapter 10, which is all these table of nations and all these
Hmm.
names, if you read through a book, another sacred text like the Quran, for example, and you go through the entire Quran, by the time you reach the end of the Quran and you compare how many place names there are there compared with the Bible, by the time you get to Genesis 10, you have all the place names in the Quran, and you've just started. So to me, that just tells you that the Bible is steeped in the land and in the history of a people that lived in real places and experienced real things. And those things can then be found and can be excavated, and you can learn about those nations. When I started working in Philistia, in the Philistine territory, we knew very little. Today, all those cities that are mentioned in the Bible have been excavated quite thoroughly, and we know so much more about that culture. Yeah, so it really helps a lot.
That's so great. I mean, yeah, the Bible it gives you a meaning from the beginning. Where are you coming from and
Yep,
where are you going?
exactly.
It's very like complete.
It is complete. It has all the philosophical questions,
Yes.
and yet it also has that history that
Yeah.
can be tested. Yeah, in a sense, you can go back and say, okay, did these places exist? Did these peoples exist? Did these events happen? And we find again and again that they have. And
Yeah.
so to me, that's very affirming and very positive.
Yeah. Um, what criteria do you use to distinguish between historical facts and symbolic elements in Bible, in biblical?
Oh, in the biblical text.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Bible, of course, is made up of 66 books written over 1,400 years, and so it contains very many different genres of literature.
Yeah.
You have the Book of Psalms, which is the largest of the books, which is basically the hymn book of ancient Israel. So the Book of Songs that they sang, and that has, yeah, that's poetry, right?
Yeah.
So you have poetry, you have prophecy, you have different type. You have narrative, you have other songs
Historic.
embedded. You have historical narrative. You have other kinds of narrative. So, um, yeah, how do you decide? It's sometimes not easy. Like in the book of Daniel, for example, we have historical. The first 6 chapters are largely historical, and then when we go to the 7th chapter and onwards through the 12th chapter, it's the visions that Daniel received, and so it becomes much more interpretive in terms of, well, what do these symbols mean? What do these things mean? And so people have grappled with that over the years. But there, it's very clear that what you're dealing with in many ways. In other places, it's more difficult. But I think throughout in Scripture, in the Bible, it's still steeped in the places. Even the Psalms, they have superscriptions, we call them. They have the introduction to the Psalm, and it will tell you a Psalm of David. And sometimes it'll even say when he was in this particular location doing this particular thing. So even the song or the poem that you're reading, which David wrote, is given a context of what he was dealing with at that time in history and how he responded to that in poetry. So, so yeah, it's very interesting to read the Bible then within that context and knowing those places and knowing those circumstances and trying to figure out those kinds of things. And
I'd love to understand the Bible as you do.
yeah, well, there's a wonderful new resource that Safali's Press just published, the Archaeological and Cultural Background Study Bible. And I wrote a number of the articles in that, but there's about 700 different articles giving the background to the Bible. And I think that's a very, very powerful new resource that we have for that.
Okay,
Sure.
cool. I'll take a look.
Yeah.
Okay, good. What ethical limits does biblical archaeology face when working with religious texts and that many consider sacred? Is that a limitation? Does scientific objectivity risk being compromised
Yeah,
by
that's a good question.
sensitivity
That's a very good question.
of religious?
Yeah. I think as believers, we have to be even more careful to be as objective as we can because we already have the criticism that we're not objective or that we're trying to set out to prove something or whatever. And so that background is on us even more. I work with all kinds of people. I have teamed up with secular archaeologists, with, agnostic, atheist archaeologists. I've worked with all kinds of people. And over the years, we've worked very well together. I respect their beliefs, they respect mine, and we try to just do good archaeology. I remember when I went to the University of Arizona to do my doctorate, a huge state university in the United States with 36,000 students. And I remember arriving on campus, a new place, new experience. And I remember my professor sat me down in his office, my major professor, and he said, um, we may see things differently philosophically and theologically, but that will not matter as long as you do good archaeology. And we had that mutual understanding throughout my doctoral studies there.
That was your first time
That was
out of
yeah,
Adventist world.
yeah, out of the Christian world, yeah. And so, we've had that mutual respect over the years, and we can agree to disagree, but he knows that I'm doing good archaeology. I'm publishing in the top journals. I'm trying to do the best work possible. And in our discipline, it's very interesting in the United States, at least, I think in Europe. Our discipline is as many of the humanities is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And what we see, because archaeology is kind of halfway in science and half in the humanities, it depends on what department you're teaching in. But he will now say, as a agnostic scholar, that the future of our disciplines is in institutions where there's still an interest and a love for the Bible. And I find that very interesting.
That's cool.
That in his entire career, he tried to separate the two, but now that he's older and looking back and realizing that programs at Harvard, programs at his own institution at Arizona, at a number of other institutions over the years have closed down, and yet the Christian institutions seem to be flourishing and seem to be still working in the field. So to me, that's encouraging to me, and I think that it's encouraging to him too as he looks at the future. What does the future hold? Well, we can do good archaeology and still be faithful Christians in that process, like in every discipline. Like in every discipline. My daughter recently had to have knee surgery, and we went to the physician, one of the top orthopedic surgeons, and he knew we were Christians, and he said, "Can I have prayer before we have surgery?" And he prayed the most beautiful prayer over my daughter's knee before he took her into surgery. And I was just, that provided a dimension to our relationship as doctor, father, patient, whatever.
Yeah,
It's just so powerful, you know?
it is.
And so, yeah.
I love when atheists are asking you to pray for them. I love that because they understand it's working. I mean, for me, it's working. Not for them because they don't believe, but because I believe, they ask me to pray for them.
Right.
It's like what
Yeah.
you're.
And
you're
I've had those experiences too,
Yeah.
where I've been asked to pray for for a certain situation, or before a meal, or and that just yeah. I remember a conversation I had a few years ago with one of my colleagues that I was working with, and he says, he says Christianity, because I work in Israel and with a lot of Jews as well, and Christianity and Judaism is completely different, he said. And I'm all, where's this coming from, And he says, in Christianity, he says, well, in Judaism, he says, as long as you do what the rabbi tells you to do, you're okay. As long as you check with the rabbi, and you're going to be fine. But in Christianity, he says, it's very personal. He says, when you pray, for example, like before we go out on the dig, and you pray in the car, it's like Jesus fills the entire car when you're praying. And he says, that's really a strange thing. And you share with him very personal things, and it's not kind of a rote repetition of a thing. It's just very personal and very intimate. It's like Jesus is in the car. He's in the room when you pray. And I never heard that. I had goosebumps, I was thinking to myself, wow, that's so powerful. I've never thought about prayer that way, but that's how he perceived it. And every time we meet now, over the last, I don't know, it's been now at least 10 years, I pray with him when we have a meal together, or when we, just had that experience 2 weeks ago in Boston again.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
Yeah,
It's
it
powerful. It means that something we're doing good.
That's right.
Something we're doing good. How does biblical archaeology respond to criticism that it seeks to confirm the Bible rather than question it with the same rigor applied to other ancient texts?
I'd like to turn the question around a little bit, because I feel sometimes that the Bible is treated very differently than other texts, particularly by secular scholars. And let me give you an example.
More rigorous than other texts.
Well, yeah, maybe not more rigorous, but more critically. For instance, Egyptian texts. I also work in Egyptology, and so I've worked on, my dissertation was in Egyptian military activity and analyzing Egyptian texts and how they describe military tactics and how that then looks in the archaeological record. So I read through, dozens and dozens of military texts in the original Egyptian language. And, when you look at Egyptologists who study these texts, well, yeah, the Egyptians believed in a myriad of gods. They had the gods are in everything. The pharaoh is receiving his direction from one of the gods, whether it's Amun-Re or someone going into battle. And so that element is there, and they just but they never question, because he receives direction from God to go into battle, or one of the Egyptian gods to go into battle, whether that battle actually took place or not.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? In other words, they don't say, well, it's a religious text, therefore it cannot be historical. They don't apply that rigor or that same presupposition or assumption to secular, it's not a secular text.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Not a biblical text. But when they come to the Bible, they say, oh, well, this is steeped in theology, and therefore, this didn't necessarily happen. It's just a theological construct that they gave, So that's one point I think that I've noticed over the years. You don't have the same criteria for the different texts, and I find that interesting. The second thing that I find is
And does the Bible overcome all those?
Yes. So this is what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
So no, it's good. It's good. So at the Bible, at the same time, you read the Egyptian text or the Assyrian text or whatever. You're reading these texts, and it's like the Egyptian Pharaoh is always victorious. He never loses a battle. Why? Because his God is leading him in battle. So he never loses a battle. He never, there's no mention of defeat in all of these texts in Egypt. Egypt's one of the oldest civilizations, for thousands of years. You're reading texts from the Old Kingdom, you're reading texts from the New Kingdom. There's no admittance of defeat from an Egyptian pharaoh, and yet we know they didn't win all the time. We've got Hittite records that say they lost certain battles, and anyway. But in the Bible, you don't have that. In the Bible, you have both the victories of God's people and the defeats of God's people. And you have both the things that the people did well and the criticism of what they didn't do well, often from a theological perspective, but both of them are there very, very clearly. And you don't have that in the other literature. It's kind of whitewashed. The other literature is kind of, we say in English, whitewashed, because it's got to be within an ideological framework where the Egyptian pharaoh is always the king god, if you will. So to me, that's an interesting perspective. And for me, the Bible then is a more balanced history than other histories, because it shows both sides of what happened. It doesn't gloss over the ugly, if you will.
Yeah, I had that question. Many ancient civilizations used epic narratives, as the Egyptian one, to legitimize their power or religion. So do you think the Bible serves a similar function beyond the spiritual value?
I think there was an element of that there in some ways, yes. Certainly it was the religious book for the people. It was the book for Jews for hundreds of years and continues to be today. So it certainly functions in some of that capacity as well. It is a history as well as a theological treatise of what happened during that history. We often say as Christians, it's his story. It's God's story and what he does through. And yet it's very different, because in the Bible, whether it's the Hebrew Bible or whether it's the New Testament as well, you have God intervening in human history constantly. Now you have that in the gods of Egypt as well. They're also intervening, but not quite in the same manner, where God sends prophets to tell the people what they're doing wrong and what will happen if they don't.
Less present, like the other gods.
Right. It's not as personal. The other gods are up there somewhere, they're doing their thing, but they're removed from people. The God of the Bible is involved. And of course, the ultimate is when Jesus himself comes to this earth. He is the God-man who shows us what God is like, in a very powerful way. So you have that element then too. But yeah, it's very, very different and very dynamic. But there are elements, of course, of the state that you see coming through and of certain things. But then you have these histories that share the good and the bad. And when you read through Kings and Chronicles, oh my goodness.
Oh yeah.
It's like, did they do anything good?
I have a list in my house. This is good. This was good. This was bad. This.
Right.
I love that.
And there's very few on the good side.
Yes,
It's mostly on the bad side, which is wow. That's human nature. Power corrupts.
Yes, I was studying regarding the chronologies that we usually don't read when we read the Bible. I studied once the chronology of Jesus, and I've never realized before that. Of course, I know that many of bad people are included, and even not Hebrew people, like Ruth or Rahab. Yeah.
Yes.
And then I saw, I don't know this name in English, Manasseh? Manasseh, yes.
The king.
The worst king.
The worst king.
Yes, and yet it's there.
Yeah.
In Jesus' chronology. And it's like, okay, Jesus can use it.
That's
I mean, you can be used no matter what.
That's
No matter what you do, you can be in his plans.
That's
and the best plans, because Jesus, well, it's the best what
That's right.
happened to humanity.
Powerful.
Yes, it is.
powerful.
It is. It
Yeah,
is.
for sure.
Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We were talking before.
Yes.
So, what about the cases like Exodus or the conquest or of Canaan?
Yes.
How do you address the lack of conclusive archaeological proof?
Yeah, the Exodus is one of the, I mean, it takes up such a huge, it's such a huge theme in the Bible. You have, the first five books of the Bible, 4 of them deal with experience of the Exodus. And then you have the conquest in Joshua and in Judges, to a certain extent. And Ruth is part of the Judges period too, right?
Yes.
So you have those books. So how do I deal with that? I teach classes in that, so I'll try to keep this short. So one thing that I share with students is that, again, what we mentioned before about the Egyptian pharaohs always being victorious.
Yeah.
If what happened to the Egyptians, as recounted in the book of Exodus, in the first few chapters of Exodus, if those things happened, from the 10 plagues to the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, potentially the Pharaoh as well, if those things happened, it would have been the most devastating of events ever to happen in Egypt. And these plagues were not only recounted as historical events. I believe there was a underlying theological element where God was deconstructing the religion of the Egyptians.
Yeah.
I mean, the Nile was worshipped as a god,
Yeah.
so he made the water not potable, made it into blood. The sun was the sun god Ra, and so he made it dark, and you have all these. We could go through the whole list of plagues that were aimed at particular gods, but at any rate, so you have this horrific event happen to Egypt. And so people will say, well, you have no evidence of the Exodus in Egyptian texts anywhere, or you don't have evidence of this or evidence of that. I don't expect to see them really necessarily, because I don't think they would have never necessarily been recorded at least in the official documents, because they were so great and they were so devastating that in the Egyptian ideology and the Egyptian concept of the cosmos, where everything had to be in perfect order, people had to live in order and truth and justice. Ma'at is the Egyptian term. This would be completely against Ma'at. And if the Egyptian pharaoh would have died, that would have been the ultimate, how shall we say, blow to the entire Egyptian ideology and concept.
Yes.
So for me, it's not surprising. Can something still turn up? Did somebody write something, somewhere secretly? Yeah, I mean, something can still turn up too, if perhaps. As far as the conquest goes, I think we do have good evidence for it in certain cities. We have. Let me give you an example from Lachish.
Okay.
The Bible says that Lachish was conquered. Well, the king of Lachish went against Joshua with a coalition of Canaanite kings in the south. Lachish was defeated. The king was, along with other kings, were killed. And then Lachish doesn't appear in the Bible for 200 years. It simply is not mentioned until the son of Solomon, Rehoboam. Suddenly, Lachish is refortified by Rehoboam in Rehoboam's, I don't remember which year, but it's refortified among the cities of Judah. We excavated Lachish. We've had now 6, almost 7 expeditions going to Lachish over the years, from the 1930s and the first British expedition to ours to several others since that time. And guess what? There is a gap in the occupation of the city, 200 years between the Canaanite period, when Lachish ceased to be a Canaanite city, and between Rehoboam's fortifications. And our team, and this is interesting because I'm working with secular Israeli scholars, but we went back to find the city from the time of Rehoboam, because that had not been really discovered, and the walls of Rehoboam. And we have just recently published, and we believe that we now have the walls of Rehoboam, or at least the walls that date back to the time of Rehoboam. We can't say for sure they're
of course.
Rehoboam, they don't have his name written on them, But we have those walls, and all the previous expeditions had said, well, we just simply haven't found them, so evidently the city wasn't occupied at that time. Well, now we're seeing that. So to me, it's very interesting. Sometimes it takes, almost 100 years for that kind of evidence. If you're not looking in the right place or you're not excavating the right location, we now have it surrounding the entire wall. So anyway, going back, I think we have good increasing evidence for these things, and we have to be cautious not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's a term we have in English. Not to throw everything out just because we still have some unresolved questions, right?
We're missing pieces.
Yeah.
Regarding the Exodus, I've heard, I'm not sure if it's true or not, that some military, like the cars of the Egyptians, were found in
In the Red Sea.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's true.
That's a good question. We often, yes, we've had a lot of videos going around on YouTube and various places over the years, and I get the question a lot because a lot of people have seen this, and there have been books that have been written about it as well. So the argument is, first of all, that these chariot wheels were found in the Gulf of Aqaba, which is not the traditional place of crossing, but another location, and that they were found down below. And every time I have checked into this, and we've had people check into this, I don't think those have really been confirmed really well. The pictures that I've seen often that I've looked at don't even look really like the chariot wheels that the Egyptians would have had. So in the New Kingdom period, when the Exodus happened, according to the biblical date for the Exodus, we can see that these chariot wheels often had 6 spokes. Sometimes they had 4, but usually 6 spokes around the wheels. And they were very, very thin. And they were very, these chariots were very delicate vehicles. They had to be highly maneuverable. They had to be, they were moving through large groups of soldiers and men. And the horses, they were very lightweight. And they were made of very lightweight materials. So number one, would they have survived that a long period of time? Number two, the wheels that I've seen have been far too...
New?
Not new is not the right word, but too bulky, they're not fine enough. The spokes are big, and the spokes that we have from King Tut's tomb and from also the Egyptian reliefs, they show very thin spokes for these vehicles. And so it doesn't really match what we know from the archaeological record in Egypt and from the historical evidence that we have. And so I'm somewhat skeptical. And we've never really had things being brought out and shown. They've been kind of fuzzy pictures that sometimes seem, I don't know, it's not always very clear.
So here's the objectivity.
Here's the objectivity, right. So as a Christian, I'd love to find evidence like that. I think it would be wonderful. And every archaeologist out there that is a Christian would be like, yes,
Finally.
The same thing goes with Noah's Ark, for example.
Yeah.
I don't know that I don't think we've actually found Noah's Ark yet. Maybe it will be found someday.
Indiana Jones.
Yeah, so those kinds of, that would be a huge find. Or the Ark of the Covenant would be a huge find. But at the same time, these are kind of sensational kind of things that people gravitate to, where archaeology is much more, like we described earlier, very mundane and very labor intensive. And you're not really looking for those kinds of things. You're trying to reconstruct what life was like, and you're finding, trying to excavate as much of the city as you can to kind of answer some specific questions. So yeah, it's a good question. We need to keep looking. Yeah, I think.
Well, that's where the faith comes. I mean,
that's right.
As you said, the Bible is, you have to be faithful.
Yeah, and I believe those things happened. I believe that there could be evidence for those things. We just have to wait. And I also think that, we have to be honest with the evidence too, and realize that sometimes just because we don't have the evidence yet doesn't mean that it didn't happen. There are many.
We have a lot.
Yeah.
It did. Yeah. It has already been proven.
For instance, Abraham. That's a good example of Abraham. Abraham wandered from Ur all the way to Canaan. And yet, if we were to travel, how far would have that been? in a European standard, maybe from here to Norway or something. I don't know. If we were to travel and there was no internet and there was no cell phones and there was no gas stations and then we wouldn't be using our credit cards and we'd be camping on the way, what evidence would we expect to find 2,000 years later of that journey?
Yeah.
From a nomad
Yeah.
going through. We wouldn't, in fact,
The bones of
in archaeology, you don't expect, there's a big debate whether nomads are even visible in the archaeological record, okay?
Is there any ancient site or civilization you would like to dig, to investigate, to excavate that you haven't?
That's interesting. When I first started excavating in archaeology and was looking for a site 25 years ago in Israel, I always dreamed of one particular city to work at, and that was Hatzor in the lower city. Tel Hatzor is the largest Old Testament site. I was very young. I was very ambitious. I was a little bit unrealistic, maybe, of what it would take to do a project like that. And I worked actually for a number of years at Hatzor in the upper city with the intent maybe someday to go to the lower city. And that didn't materialize at the time, and for good reasons, I think. And so I went to work at the other sites we talked about, Kayafa, Lachish, Sucho, different places. And then just before the pandemic in 2019, my colleagues from Israel contacted me and said, we have just received word that we want to start a new project at the lower city in Hatzor. So in 2019 in September, I went. And we did a pilot excavation for about 10 days or so with about 40 people in the gate area that had been excavated 60 years earlier by another team. And the city, that lower city is huge. It's 180 acres. I don't know how much that would be in hectares, maybe 70 hectares or something like that.
Well calculated and down.
Yeah. But anyway, it's huge. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And we had planned a big project in 2020 for that, and I had purchased 50 tickets for staff and students to go, and then, of course, the whole world shut down in March of that year. So that didn't materialize. But I'll be honest with you, 25 years later, I don't have that real ambition anymore. I think that I have been pleasantly surprised in my career to be able to excavate some of the most fabulous sites that exist. And I was able to also excavate at Hatzor for a number of years. But to me, I now have to be careful not to overcommit to more projects because I have all the publications now to work on the projects that we've already done. And that takes a lot of time to finish. So this year I'm going to be on sabbatical living in Jerusalem, and I'm going to be working on those publications, and that's what I need to accomplish now in this part of my life. And it's now up to a younger generation to continue those projects. And I'll mentor and help them and be there on the digs with them too. But as far as directing a project and doing all that, I think I'm very pleased with what we've been able to do over the years. And it's incredible to me how you have certain ideas and certain plans, and then God takes those ideas and he surprises you with things that are even better that you didn't anticipate. And that's how I've experienced it in my life. It's just been one thing after another, and sometimes I've had to sit back and kind of pinch myself and think, is this real? Am I really digging at this site? I mean, could this even be possible? And it's just been a real blessing and humbling at the same time, because you never know as an archaeologist when you go in the field that you're going to find anything.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what's under the ground until you start excavating. And yet we've been privileged to find some really incredible things over the years, and it's been really cool.
That's cool. I love when people they feel fulfilled with what they've done.
Yeah.
And it's powerful, and it's mentoring for the others that are coming.
That's right.
If you could go back in time, where would you go? What event would you witness? Would you love to witness?
That's a great question. I heard this question asked. I was excavating with the Harvard excavation project at Ashkelon, a Philistine site many years ago now. And a student asked the question of the director of that project. And I'll never forget the answer. He said, I would not like to go back in time, he said. And everybody's like, surprised, what? And he says, because if I went back in time and saw how things really were, I probably would have to rewrite and rethink everything, because we're only guessing with pieces of this and that of what life was like. So that was a very humble answer and a very good answer. But, yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, there's so much history and there's so many different episodes of history. I guess in the last decade or so of my career, I've been focusing more on David and King David. And I just, I'd love to go back to that time and kind of see what life was like at that time and how the kingdom had developed. We talk about state formation. How did he develop the state of Israel into this united kingdom that the Bible talks about? Because there's a lot of debate about that still, and how extensive the kingdom was, and how what did Solomon inherit and what did he do? And I think David, to me, is one of the most compelling persons in the Bible because he's mentioned more often than any other person in the Bible, almost 1,000 times.
Despite
all the things that he did wrong,
yes, exactly.
he was mentioned and remembered because it was through David that the Messiah was promised, and through his father Jesse. And
he recovered.
And he recovered. And Solomon also recovered at the end. And even Manasseh, who we talked about, who was so wicked at the very end of his life, had a conversion experience. And so there's hope. There's hope for all of us. And so to me, recovering those stories and recovering the stories of those people who went through so much, they're encouraging to us too today, because God is working in our lives too.
Thank you, Dr. Michael. Thank you very much for being with us, for your time, which is priceless. And
it's a privilege.
Thank you for all the insight of all of this you've given us.
Thank you.